Good evening, and welcome to the Sleepy Biographer. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Find a comfortable place, let your body settle, and allow the weight of the day to begin to lift. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench, and your breathing slow to its own quiet rhythm. Because tonight, we are not simply sitting with a chapter of American history. We are riding out across the wide-open plains of the frontier. Dust on the wind, the smell of sage and dry earth. Walking beside one of the most complicated, mythologized, debated, and deeply human figures the American West ever produced. Tonight, we tell the story of Wyatt Earp. And what a story it is. Not the legend polished smooth by 100 Hollywood films. Not the gleaming hero of dime novels and television serials. But the real man. Flawed and formidable, restless and brave, tender and ruthless in equal measure. A man who lived through an era unlike any the world had seen before or since, when the American frontier was still raw and wild and the rules had not yet been written. A man who made himself and unmade himself and made himself again. A man who outlived his own legend, only to watch that legend come roaring back to life after his death. So breathe in slowly now, and breathe out long and easy. If you are in bed, feel the softness beneath you. If you are resting somewhere quiet, let the stillness hold you. The story of Wyatt Earp begins long before the gunfight, long before Tombstone, long before any of the names you already know. It begins in a small Illinois town in the middle of the 19th century, with a restless family and a boy who would spend the next 80 years never quite standing still. On March 19, 1848, Wyatt Berry Stapp Earp was born in Monmouth, Illinois, the fourth child of Nicholas Porter Earp and his second wife, Virginia Ann Cooksey. Nicholas, a complicated, commanding man who had served in the Mexican-American War, named his son after his commanding officer, Captain Wyatt Berry Stapp of the Illinois Mounted Volunteers. But that's not all. Monmouth sat in Warren County, a place settled by Scots-Irish families who brought with them a fierce independence, a distrust of authority they had not chosen for themselves, and a habit of moving when the land around them felt too crowded or too settled. Wyatt came from that tradition. The restlessness that would define his whole life was not a personal quirk. It was a cultural inheritance, the legacy of generations of people who believed that something better was always available, just beyond the next range of hills. The year of Wyatt's birth was a year of enormous motion. Gold had been discovered in California just weeks before he was born, and the news was spreading through the country that the West held unimaginable riches. The great California gold rush of 1849 would pull 100,000 people across the continent in a single year, transforming the geography of American ambition and setting in motion the processes of Western settlement that would define the next half-century. Wyatt Earp was born into a country already pointed west, already dreaming of gold and open land, and the freedom that came with distance from the places you had started from. Nicholas Earp was a man who could never quite stay put. He had been born in North Carolina, moved to Kentucky, then to Illinois, and kept moving for the rest of his life. A farmer, a constable, a justice of the peace, a barrel maker, a man of many occupations and restless ambitions. He was also deeply opinionated, politically passionate, and fierce in his convictions. The Earps were Union Republicans to the bone, and Nicholas instilled in his sons a respect for law, order, and the authority of the badge. though in the years that followed, that respect would be tested, and sometimes bent entirely out of shape. His wife Virginia was the softer force in the household, the one who smoothed and mediated and kept the peace. But it was Nicholas's iron will, his ambition, his refusal to accept that life was simply what had been handed to him. That shaped the Earp boys more than anything else. Virginia Earp was the counterweight to Nicholas's fierce temper. Quieter and more patient, she held the family together through the constant moves, the arguments, and the chaos of raising a large and boisterous household. Wyatt had 4 brothers who would play central roles throughout his life. James, born in 1841, Virgil, born in 1843, Morgan, born in 1851, and Warren, born in 1855. He also had a half-brother named Newton from Nicholas's first marriage. 2 sisters, Martha and Virginia Ann, did not survive childhood. Small losses folded into the larger story of a family always on the move. Death moved through mid-19th century American communities with brutal efficiency, and medicine was largely helpless against the major killers. You buried your children, and you kept going. That was simply how it was. When Wyatt was just 2 years old, the family relocated to Pella, Iowa, where Nicholas established himself on farmland and worked as a constable and justice of the peace. Pella was a Dutch community, deeply religious and tightly knit, and the Earp boys were known for getting into scraps with the local Dutch families. There is even a story of a fight the Earp boys got into with a family called the Garces, in which one of the boys took off his wooden shoe and clobbered young Wyatt with it. The Dutch settlers of Pella had come from the Netherlands in the late 1840s seeking religious freedom, and had built their community with a strong sense of identity and tradition. That set them apart from neighboring families. The cultural friction was practically guaranteed. The Earp children grew up knowing that the world was bigger than the fields around them. Their father talked constantly of the West, of California, of gold, of new beginnings. And then the Civil War broke out in 1861, and suddenly the world came crashing into their quiet Iowa life. James enlisted and went to war. Virgil enlisted and went to war. Their half-brother Newton went to war. Wyatt, just 13 years old, ran away from home at least twice trying to enlist as well, only to be dragged back by his father each time. Nicholas had left the family himself to recruit soldiers for the Union Army, and in his absence put Wyatt in charge of the farm, perhaps knowing that keeping the boy occupied was the only way to keep him from running off again. The war itself was reshaping the country in ways that would matter enormously for what came after. The destruction of the Southern slave economy, the opening of the transcontinental railroad, the massive movement of populations. All of these things were creating the conditions for the great westward surge that would define the second half of the 19th century. And for the Earps, as for millions of other families, the end of the war was not an ending, but a launching point. James Earp had been badly wounded, shot through the shoulder in a way that left him with limited use of his arm for the rest of his life. He came home changed, as all of them did. Virgil came home harder and more purposeful, having served through significant combat. The reunion of the brothers must have been a charged occasion. Young men who had been boys when they left, returning as something else entirely, carrying the weight of what they had seen and endured. The Civil War ended in 1865, and when the Earp brothers came home, the family began to prepare for its next great move. Nicholas had been dreaming of California for years, and in 1864, before the war had even ended, he organized a wagon train west, an extraordinary undertaking of months of travel across open plains and mountain passes, through territories that were still genuinely wild and dangerous. Wyatt, now 16, rode alongside the wagon as a hunter, shooting game to feed the party. He was already handy with a rifle, already beginning to develop the steady nerves and quiet patience that would define him. The wagon train moved slowly westward through summer and fall, following routes that thousands of families had taken before them. There were no roads in the modern sense, only trails worn into the earth by the wagons and feet and hooves that had passed before. For a 16-year-old boy whose entire previous world had been the flat farmland of Iowa and Illinois, crossing the continent by wagon was something else entirely. Terrifying, yes, also transformative. The vastness of the country, the smallness of a human life against all that land and sky. He felt it out there in a way no amount of schooling could have taught him. When something needed doing on the trail, you did it yourself or it did not get done. Wyatt is said to have witnessed his first gunfight somewhere along that journey, though the details are lost to the fog of family memory and legend. By the end of 1864, the Earp family arrived in the area around San Bernardino, California, and Wyatt began a new chapter of his life, driving freight wagons, hauling supplies along treacherous mountain roads, working in railroad camps, learning the hard physical rhythms of frontier labor. California in those years was a place of extraordinary energy and impermanence, still sorting itself out in the aftermath of the gold rush. The rush itself had been largely over for a decade, but the infrastructure it had created, the towns, the ports, the political institutions, remained, and California was now a state full of ambition and argument, and the particular energy of a place where every person was a recent arrival from somewhere else. Wyatt moved through it all with the watchful, adaptive quality that would mark his whole life, observing, learning, calculating. In 1865, Wyatt took a job with a freight company driving the 60-mile run between San Bernardino and Los Angeles, a route that wound through rugged country and required a steady hand and a steady nerve. He worked at this for a couple of years, and then he and brother Virgil found work with construction crews of the Union Pacific Railroad in what would eventually become Wyoming. It was hard, unglamorous work, carrying supplies, maintaining equipment, existing in the temporary cities that sprang up along the railroad line and then evaporated as the tracks moved on. By 1868, most of the Earps had returned east to Illinois and then to Missouri, and Wyatt followed. He arrived in Lamar, Missouri in late 1869, where his father Nicholas had settled and was serving as a constable. And it was here that the first great love of Wyatt's life appeared. Her name was Urilla Sutherland, 20 years old, the daughter of William and Pamelia Sutherland, who ran the Exchange Hotel in Lamar. They were married on January the 10th, 1870, with his father Nicholas, now serving as Justice of the Peace, officiating. Wyatt bought a lot on the edge of town and built a house. And when Nicholas stepped down from his position as constable, Wyatt was appointed in his place. He was 21 years old, with a wife he loved, a home he had built with his own hands, and his first badge pinned to his chest. Lamar offered Wyatt something he had never quite had before, a sense of rootedness, of belonging to a place rather than simply passing through it. He had a job that meant something, a community that recognized him, a woman beside him who made the house feel like a home rather than just a stopping place. But the happiness did not last. Urilla was pregnant with their first child when typhoid fever swept through Lamar. She died before the year was out, and the baby with her. Wyatt lost everything in a matter of months. He sold the house, lost his footing, and lost whatever compass had been guiding him. After Urilla died, Wyatt was charged with stealing county money. He was accused of stealing horses in Indian Territory. He ran. For the next few years, he was lost. Saloons, brothels, frontier shadows. The loss of Urilla and their unborn child was the wound around which everything else organized itself. Grief of that magnitude does not just make a person sad. It makes them a different person, strips away everything that had given the days their shape, and leaves a kind of wilderness where there had been a home. He spent time in Peoria, Illinois, arrested multiple times in connection with establishments of ill repute. There is nothing particularly heroic about this period of his life. It was a time of grief and drift, of a young man without direction doing whatever he needed to survive in a world that did not offer many soft landings. And that's worth acknowledging directly, not to diminish him, but to understand him. The Wyatt Earp, who would eventually become a lawman, was not born virtuous and steady. He was forged through loss and failure and a slow, patient rebuilding. The worst chapters of a life do not have to be the final ones, and the distance between where a person is and where they want to be is not fixed. Sometime around 1871 to 1873, Wyatt spent time as a buffalo hunter on the Great Plains. This was the era of the Great Buffalo Slaughter, when professional hunters were systematically driving the vast herds to near extinction, to feed railroad crews and the hide market. At $3.50 per hide, a man who killed 10 animals a day could earn more in a week than most men made in a month. The buffalo herds were among the great wonders of the North American continent. Vast moving masses that could stretch for miles in every direction, that shook the earth when they ran, that had been part of the landscape since before human memory. The Comanche, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa. Entire civilizations had been built around the buffalo and the annual migrations. Within a decade, the great herds that had roamed the plains for millennia were functionally gone. Wyatt moved across all of it, watching, learning, developing the stillness and patience that would one day make him one of the most formidable lawmen on the frontier. The plains were training for the kind of quiet he needed, the ability to wait without fidgeting, to scan a horizon without missing anything, to act decisively when the moment required it, and to hold perfectly still when stillness was what was called for. There was a social dimension to the work as well. The buffalo hunting camps were rough, transient communities, collections of hunters and skinners and traders, men from every background drawn together by the economics of the hide trade. Violence was not uncommon. Wyatt learned to read these situations, to sense when something was tipping from argument toward danger, to position himself advantageously when the atmosphere grew charged. He was learning, in other words, what it meant to be the kind of man that other men thought twice about challenging. By 1874, he was in Wichita. The cattle drives had come in force up the Chisholm Trail from Texas, and the town had exploded. Cowboys off months on the trail with pay and thirst, gamblers and saloon keepers ready to take both, lawmen trying to keep order over a population that barely wanted any. Wyatt had Mattie Blaylock with him, a relationship that would stretch on for years and end badly. He worked saloons as a bouncer and enforcer, the grey space between legal and not. In 1875, something shifted. Wyatt was brought onto the Wichita police force and began to distinguish himself as a man who could handle trouble without creating more of it. Someone with the physical presence and cold nerve to face down dangerous men without firing a shot. His reputation grew. He was calm and patient, with a gift for what his contemporaries called pistol whipping, subduing troublemakers with the barrel of his gun rather than the trigger, a technique that required confidence bordering on the reckless. And in Wichita, he also began to develop his understanding of the relationship between law enforcement and the economics of a frontier town. He saw how saloon owners and gambling house operators and the more respectable merchants all had competing interests that had to be balanced. He understood that the men who held badges were beholden to the men who appointed them, and that the line between enforcing the law and serving the interests of the powerful was often very thin. Wyatt left Wichita in 1876 after a physical altercation with a man running for city marshal against a friend of his, and made his way to Dodge City, Kansas. If Wichita had been wild, Dodge City was something else entirely. Built up practically overnight along the Santa Fe Railroad, Dodge had exploded into the cattle trade hub of the entire region, and by the mid-1870s had a well-earned reputation as the most violent, turbulent, wide-open town in the United States. One visitor reported finding a city of 700 people, serviced by 14 saloons, 2 dance halls, and 47 prostitutes. The Boot Hill Cemetery, where the victims of the town's chronic violence were buried boots on and without ceremony, had given the place a name that sent a chill down the spine of anyone who knew what it meant. Dodge City was a place of extraordinary contradictions. Raw and brutal, yes, but also a place of ambition and commerce, of people genuinely trying to build something out of the chaos of the cattle trade. The physical layout reinforced this. The deadline was the name given to the railroad tracks that divided the town. Respectable, law-abiding commerce on one side, and the saloons, gambling dens, and brothels on the other. Cowboys arriving in Dodge were expected to check their weapons when they crossed into the respectable side. In practice, the line was porous, the enforcement inconsistent, and the lawmen spent considerable time simply moving men and their weapons from one side of an invisible line to the other. The Long Branch Saloon, the Lady Gay, the Alamo, the Varieties. These were not simply bars. They were the social centers of a community without the usual civic institutions. The places where information was exchanged, deals were made, friendships formed, and feuds began. They ran continuously, day and night, because the cattle trade had no respect for business hours. And through it all, the lawmen moved, watching, gauging, intervening when necessary, building the web of relationships and reputations that was, in the end, the most powerful law enforcement tool available. Into this world stepped Wyatt Earp, now 28 years old, scarred by grief and several years of moral drift, and ready at last to find his footing as a lawman. He was hired as a deputy marshal and quickly established himself as exactly the kind of officer the town needed: steady, fearless, and pragmatic. His method was simple and effective. He preferred to buffalo men, to disarm them by striking them with his pistol, rather than to shoot them, because a dead cowboy was bad for business and bad for the town's reputation, while a disarmed and embarrassed one usually got back on the trail without further trouble. The Dodge City newspapers praised him regularly, and citizens wrote letters commending his work. He was, in those years, doing what he did best, and doing it well. One incident in particular spread Wyatt's reputation up and down the cattle trails. In 1877, the Texas gunfighter Clay Allison rode into Dodge in a dangerous mood, intent on settling a score over a fellow cowboy killed by a Dodge city policeman. Allison was genuinely dangerous, a man with a hair-trigger temper and a willingness to use violence as a first resort. And the story goes that Wyatt faced Allison down with a composure so complete and so utterly without agitation, that Allison simply turned and rode away, without the confrontation either man might have expected. Whether or not the story is perfectly accurate in its details, it captures something true about how Wyatt operated. The weapon he relied on most was not the gun at his hip, but the quality of stillness he projected, the message that any escalation would be more costly than the aggressor wanted to pay. Deadwood pulled him north for a while. Gold in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, thousands of men flooding in. He arrived not long after Wild Bill Hickok had been shot in the back while playing poker. On August 2nd, 1876, in Nuttall and Mann's saloon. Hickok had been sitting with his back to the door, an unusual position for a man so experienced in the ways of frontier violence, and a drifter named Jack McCall had shot him through the back of the head. And the poker hand Hickok had been holding at the moment of his death, two pair, aces and eights, became known ever after as the dead man's hand, a piece of folklore that outlasted almost everything else about the story. Wyatt tried his hand at the gold fields, found little opportunity there, and set up a firewood business over the winter, charging $12 per cord of wood, with desperate gamblers paying up to $50 during extreme cold snaps. It was a practical, unsentimental approach to an opportunity. He returned to Dodge City in 1878 as assistant marshal, and it was during this second stint in Dodge that two of the defining relationships of his life began to take shape. The first was with William Bartholomew Masterson, known to history as Bat. Masterson was young, quick-witted, and devastatingly confident, a man who had survived the Battle of Adobe Walls against Comanche warriors, and was already building the reputation that would make him legendary. Adobe Walls, June 1874. A large force of Comanche, Cheyenne, and Kiowa warriors, led by Quanah Parker, attacked a settlement of buffalo hunters in the Texas Panhandle. Badly outnumbered, the hunters held them off with long-range Sharps rifles from inside the adobe buildings. Bat Masterson was 19 years old that day. The experience had a way of clarifying things. The friendship between Wyatt and Bat was one of genuine mutual respect and affection, forged in the nightly work of keeping order in the wickedest place in America. They were different men. Bat was more gregarious, more willing to perform for an audience, more comfortable with his own celebrity. Wyatt was more guarded, more private, more suspicious of the attention he attracted. But they understood each other's code, respected each other's abilities, and trusted each other in the way that men who have worked dangerous situations together develop a particular kind of trust. They would be allies, supporters, and occasional rescuers of each other for decades to come. In later years, Bat Masterson moved to New York City and became a sports columnist for the New York Morning Telegraph, writing about boxing and athletic contests with the same sharp eye and blunt assessments. He had once applied to gunfighters on the Kansas plains. The frontier lawman turned New York sports writer. It is one of the stranger transformations of the era. The second relationship that took shape during these years was the most unlikely friendship of Wyatt's long life. His name was John Henry Holliday, and he was, in almost every respect, Wyatt Earp's opposite. Where Wyatt was physically imposing, healthy, and methodical, Doc Holliday was slight, tubercular, and volatile. Where Wyatt was patient, Doc was impulsive. And where Wyatt stayed alive through caution and calculation, Doc seemed almost indifferent to whether he lived or died, a quality that made him either very brave or very dangerous, depending on which side of him you happened to be standing on. Doc Holliday had been born in Griffin, Georgia, on August 14, 1851, the son of a Confederate officer. His mother, Alice Jane McKee, died of tuberculosis when John Henry was just 15 years old. He enrolled at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia at the age of 19, graduating in 1872. He returned to Georgia and set up a practice, but almost immediately was diagnosed with the same disease that had taken his mother: pulmonary tuberculosis, slow and relentless and, in that era, almost certainly fatal. Doctors told him to go west, where the drier air might slow the disease's progress. He went, and the West transformed him. The dry air may have slowed his physical decline, but it had no effect on the path his life was taking. The Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery was one of the finest dental schools in the country at the time, and Doc Holliday was a genuinely skilled practitioner of his trade. In his early years in Texas, he even won awards at regional dental fairs for the quality of his work. But the cough that accompanied his tuberculosis made it impossible to practice. Patients did not want to sit in a dentist's chair with a man whose lungs were slowly failing him, coughing over their open mouths. The profession that had seemed like the beginning of a respectable life became an impossible dream. He turned to the card table because it paid, and found that he had a natural gift for the games of chance and strategy that frontier saloons offered. He was also quick to violence in a way that suggested he had decided, since he was likely dying anyway, that the usual considerations keeping ordinary men cautious simply did not apply to him. He killed men, made dangerous enemies, and moved constantly, from Dallas to Denver to Cheyenne to Dodge City, always one step ahead of the consequences of his own behavior, always accompanied by his devoted and tempestuous companion, a woman known as Big Nose Kate, whose real name was Mary Catherine Heroni, born in Budapest, Hungary in 1850, was one of the more extraordinary figures in the orbit of the Earp story. She had come to America as a child, lost her parents, and drifted into the frontier world of saloons and prostitution. And in Doc Holliday, she found a partner whose combination of danger, intelligence, and desperate tenderness matched something in her own character. They quarreled violently and constantly, separated and reunited, loved each other in the oblique, complicated way of two people who have both seen too much of the world's hard side to trust easily. She was not the passive companion of legend. She was fierce and capable, and on at least one occasion broke Doc out of jail by setting a fire to create a distraction, an act of devotion and lawlessness that perfectly captured the relationship. Wyatt and Doc first met sometime around 1877 in Fort Griffin, Texas, where Wyatt was passing through on the trail of a train robber. He stopped at a saloon owned by an old acquaintance, who pointed him toward the pale, coughing dentist-turned-gambler dealing cards at a table in the corner. And Holliday, who ordinarily hated lawmen, took a liking to Wyatt almost immediately, and gave him useful information about the man he was tracking. The friendship was sealed sometime shortly after, when Doc reportedly stepped in to prevent Wyatt from being killed in a confrontation in Dodge City, backing down a group of armed cowboys who were crowding him. Wyatt never forgot it. What Wyatt saw in Doc, and what Doc saw in Wyatt, was something that both men seemed to have recognized immediately. Doc was educated, sardonic, and possessed of a dark wit that cut through pretension and self-importance like a scalpel. He told Wyatt what he thought, without diplomatic softening, and in a world full of flatterers and men angling for advantage, that quality was worth more than gold. And Wyatt, in turn, offered Doc something that the gambler's wandering life had never provided: genuine loyalty, the unconditional kind, the kind that showed up when you needed it. Bat Masterson, who knew both men well, described Doc with characteristic bluntness: a man with a mean disposition and an ungovernable temper, but also with nerves of absolute steel, what Bat called the most skillful gambler and nerviest, deadliest man with a six-gun he had ever known. Wyatt himself described his friend more tenderly: a dentist whom necessity had made a gambler, a gentleman whom disease had made a vagabond, a philosopher whom life had made a caustic wit, and the most loyal friend he ever had. Wyatt left Dodge City in 1879. He was 31 years old and had heard from his brother Virgil, who was already in the Arizona Territory, about a place called Tombstone. A prospector named Ed Schieffelin had discovered silver there in 1877, and the discovery had set off a rush that was transforming a patch of rugged desert into one of the most dynamic boom towns in the American Southwest. By late 1879, the Earps were converging on Tombstone. Schieffelin's discovery had come with a dark forewarning. Soldiers at Fort Huachuca had told him the only thing he would find in hostile Apache country was his tombstone. And he found silver instead, naming his first claim after the warning. The name stuck to the mine, and then to the town that grew up around it, carrying with it from the beginning a quality of dark romance that would eventually attract the story that made it famous. There are places that seem to draw certain kinds of events toward them, and Tombstone was one of those places. Wyatt arrived in December of 1879, accompanied by Matty Blaylock and his brother James. Virgil was already there, appointed as a deputy United States Marshal. Morgan would arrive the following year. Warren would follow. Tombstone in 1880 and 1881 was extraordinary. It had grown from nothing to a city of several thousand people in just a couple of years, drawing prospectors and businessmen and lawyers and outlaws and gamblers, and a surprising number of ambitious, educated people who had come to seek their fortunes in the silver veins threading through the Sonoran desert hills. Two newspapers, the Tombstone Epitaph and the Nugget, ran competing versions of reality, each fiercely partisan, each shaping the story of what was happening in real time. There were churches and schools and a thriving theater district, alongside the brothels and the gambling dens, because that is the nature of boom towns. They contain everything, all at once, pressed together with the intensity of a place that knows it might not last. The Tombstone of 1880 sat at the intersection of several powerful forces. It was a Republican town by inclination, oriented toward law and commerce, connected to the national economy through its silver production, and the powerful Wells Fargo network that moved the silver east. And it was surrounded by a county, Cochise County, named for the great Apache war chief who had only died in 1874, dominated by democratic ranching interests, and a culture of frontier independence that bristled at centralized law enforcement. These two power structures, with their competing visions of how order should be maintained and who should benefit from it, were on a collision course. Long before the Earps arrived, Wyatt settled in quickly. He took a quarter interest in the faro game at the Oriental Saloon, managing the gambling concession and providing security for the establishment. He also worked as a shotgun rider on the Wells Fargo stage lines, protecting silver shipments through the dangerous country between Tombstone and Tucson. And he sought appointment as county sheriff when Cochise County was carved out of the larger Pima County in early 1881. But the position went to a Democrat named Johnny Behan, and this disappointment would have consequences that neither man could foresee. The story of Wyatt's rivalry with Johnny Behan runs deeper than simple political opposition. Behan was not a monster. He was a career politician and sometime lawman with local knowledge and local connections that Wyatt lacked, and he genuinely believed that the Earps were arrogant outsiders, using the badge to advance their own interests rather than the community's. There was something to this criticism. The Earps did have significant business interests in Tombstone: the gambling operations, the real estate investments, the Wells Fargo relationship, and there were moments when it was genuinely difficult to tell where their law enforcement duties ended and their personal economic calculations began. But Behan's critique was being made by a man who was himself using the machinery of county government to protect the Cowboys' operations, which was considerably worse. Then there was Josephine. Sarah Marcus had arrived in Tombstone in late 1880, a young woman of remarkable energy, who had been born in Brooklyn to German-Jewish immigrant parents and had grown up in San Francisco. She had left her family at a young age to join a touring theater company performing Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore, and had eventually made her way to Arizona. She had come to Tombstone as the companion of Johnny Behan, who had promised to marry her. He did not keep that promise, and by 1881 their relationship was over. Josephine was free, sharp-eyed, curious, and alive to everything happening around her in that volatile, electric little city. She and Wyatt became drawn to one another during the extraordinary months of 1881. What is beyond doubt is that by the time the events of October 1881 set Tombstone's history in stone, Wyatt Earp and Josephine Marcus had found each other. They would remain together for the rest of his life. 47 years. Inseparable in their wandering, devoted in their complicated way. The conflict that would define the Earp legend had been building since before the Earps arrived in Tombstone, rooted in the political and economic landscape of Cochise County. On one side stood the Earps and their allies, Republican businessmen, the Tombstone Epitaph, the urban law and order faction that believed in enforcing the law as written. On the other side stood a loosely organized group known as the Cowboys, ranchers and cattle thieves, rustlers who crossed the Mexican border to steal livestock and sell it for profit, men who operated in the borderlands with the protection of Sheriff Behan's Democratic administration. And the leaders of the Cowboy faction were the Clanton family. Old Newman Haynes Clanton, known as Old Man Clanton, and his sons, including the volatile, boastful Ike and the younger Billy. Allied with them were brothers Frank and Tom McClory, and a cast of supporting characters that included Johnny Ringo and Curly Bill Brocius. The tensions escalated through 1881. There were cattle thefts, stage robberies, confrontations, and threats. In August of 1881, 15 Mexican civilians carrying gold and bullion were ambushed and murdered in Skeleton Canyon, an atrocity that pointed toward the Cowboys. And in September, Mexican soldiers killed 5 cowboys, including Old Man Clanton, in retaliation. The border was soaked in blood. In Tombstone itself, Wyatt had attempted to negotiate a secret arrangement with Ike Clanton, offering reward money in exchange for information about stage robbers. But the deal fell apart, and Ike became increasingly paranoid that Wyatt would expose him to his cowboy associates. The distrust and the anger were building towards something. That could not be undone. The City Council had passed an ordinance in April 1881, requiring anyone carrying weapons, Bowie knives, pistols, rifles, to deposit them at a livery stable or saloon upon entering town. Then, in October 1881, everything compressed into a single afternoon. On the night of October 25th, Ike Clanton and Tom McClory came to Tombstone for supplies. They drank heavily. Ike had a running argument with Doc Holliday in the small hours of the morning, and by the time dawn came on October 26th, he had been up all night, drunk, armed despite the city ordinance that prohibited it, and making loud threats against the Earps. And Virgil and Morgan pistol-whipped both Ike and Tom McClory during that morning, disarming them roughly and hauling them before a judge. The fines were paid. But the Cowboys did not leave town. By early afternoon, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and a man named Billy Claiborne had ridden into Tombstone. They found their brothers and companions nursing their humiliations and their bruises. Billy Clanton and Frank McClory were both armed, both angry, and both determined to make a point. And they gathered in a vacant lot on Fremont Street, just behind the OK Corral. Word reached Virgil, who was both the United States Deputy Marshal and the City Marshal, that armed men were gathered in violation of the ordinance. He deputized Wyatt and Morgan and asked Doc Holliday to carry a shotgun concealed under a long coat. They walked down Fremont Street, 4 abreast, into the afternoon. What happened in the next 30 seconds has been argued over, written about, filmed, debated, and reinterpreted for over a century. The parties stood within feet of each other. Virgil told the Cowboys to surrender their weapons. What happened next is genuinely contested. Witnesses gave contradictory accounts. Newspapers reported opposing versions, and the hearings that followed produced testimony shaped by politics and loyalty as much as by memory. What is not contested is the result. In approximately 30 seconds, with somewhere between 25 and 30 shots fired at close range, 3 men died: Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Tom McClory, and 3 of the Earp party were wounded: Virgil in the leg, Morgan in the shoulder, Doc Holliday grazed across the hip. Only Wyatt Earp emerged from the gunfight entirely unscathed. He would be the only man on either side who never took a bullet in any fight of his long life. Billy Clanton, shot through the chest in the opening moments, continued fighting even after he should have been incapacitated, shooting with his left hand after his right wrist was broken by a bullet, calling out for more ammunition as he lay dying against a wall. He was 19 years old. Frank McClory, gut shot early in the fight, managed to wound Doc Holliday before going down. And Tom McClory, who some witnesses insisted was unarmed, died from a shotgun blast. The debate about whether Tom McClory was genuinely armed or reached for a weapon in the confusion of the opening seconds has never been settled to everyone's satisfaction, and it remained a source of lasting controversy about the justness of the fight. The bodies of the 3 dead cowboys were laid out in a parlor on Allen Street, with a sign reading, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone." Ike Clanton filed murder charges against the Earps and Holliday, and Sheriff Behan, who had witnessed the fight and sided with the Cowboys, supported the prosecution. A 30-day preliminary hearing before Judge Wells Spicer heard from dozens of witnesses, produced hundreds of pages of testimony, and ultimately concluded that the Earps and Holliday had been acting within the law, that they were fully justified in committing these homicides. The acquittal did not end the feud. It detonated it. They came for Virgil first. On the evening of December 28, 1881, just over 2 months after the gunfight, Virgil Earp was walking back to his hotel when 3 men stepped out of the shadows and opened fire with shotguns. Virgil survived, but a shotgun blast shattered his left elbow, destroying the arm permanently. He would never have full use of it again. The Cowboys were not finished. On the night of March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was playing billiards at Hatch's Saloon on Allen Street. Through the glass panel of a door, from the darkness of an alley outside, a bullet was fired into the room. Morgan was struck in the back. He died within the hour, his brothers around him, on the floor of a billiard hall. He was 30 years old. Morgan Earp had been, by the accounts of those who knew him, the most naturally warm and personable of the Earp brothers, the one most likely to laugh, the one whose company men sought for reasons beyond his usefulness as an ally. His death in that billiard hall, shot from the darkness through a glass door by unknown hands, was not the death of a combatant. It was the death of a man who had gone out to play billiards on a Saturday night. The randomness of it, the cowardice of it, it made the gunfight look almost clean by comparison. Wyatt was there when his brother died. He was holding him when it happened. Something shifted in Wyatt Earp that night. That would never shift back. 2 days after Morgan's murder, Wyatt took charge of putting his brother's body on a train to California, where Morgan would be buried near the family home in Colton. He accompanied Virgil and the Earp women to the station in Tucson, and as he stood on the platform watching the train prepare to leave, he saw Frank Stillwell, a man identified as a suspect in Morgan's murder, one of Behan's former deputies, a known cowboy associate, lurking in the rail yard. Wyatt followed him into the darkness of the yard. Stillwell was found dead the next morning, shot multiple times at very close range. Wyatt went back to Tombstone and put together a posse. Federal warrants, technically within the law. Nobody believed that, including the men with the warrants. It was a vendetta ride, blood debt, the oldest kind of justice there is, barely dressed up in legal clothes. The posse included his brother Warren, Doc Holliday, and several other men. And for the next several weeks, from late March into April of 1882, they moved through the southeastern corner of Arizona Territory, hunting the men they held responsible for the attacks on Virgil and the murder of Morgan. The Vendetta Ride covered some of the most beautiful and most desolate country in the American Southwest. The Dragoon Mountains, the San Pedro River Valley, the wide desert basins where the creosote stretched to every horizon, and the sky was a blue so deep it seemed almost violet. Several cowboys died on that ride. The most notable was Curly Bill Brosius, a prominent cowboy who Wyatt claimed to have killed in a dramatic, close-range confrontation at a place called Mescal Spring. Wyatt walked away from the fight carrying bullet holes in his coat, but unhurt. But the pressure of multiple hostile posses and the shifting legal winds eventually made further operations untenable. Wyatt and his companions rode out of Arizona Territory along the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks into New Mexico and did not return. Wyatt Earp rode out of Arizona in April 1882 with warrants for his own arrest pending in the territory, and he never went back. Arizona ended the friendship with Doc Holliday. In Albuquerque, where the posse stopped for a few weeks, Doc, drunk, bitter, dying by inches, furious at everything, said something that cut the friendship to the bone. The exact words are disputed, but the substance was a slur about Wyatt's relationship with Josephine Marcus and her Jewish background. Wyatt left the table and walked away. Though the two men saw each other briefly a few more times over the following years, the old intimacy was never restored. Doc Holliday died in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, on November 8, 1887, at 36 years old, in a sanatorium bed. He looked down at his bare feet with surprise and reportedly said, "This is funny." He had expected to die with his boots on. After years of living by the gun, of being the scariest man in rooms full of scary men, of existing in a perpetual state of armed readiness, Doc Holliday died in bed, in a room that smelled of medicine and coal smoke, and the particular staleness of a place where the windows are kept closed against the cold. He died of the disease that had been pursuing him since he was 22 years old, the disease that had driven him from Georgia into the West, that had changed him from a dentist into a gambler, from a respectable man into a legend. The friendship between Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday was one of the strangest the frontier produced, and its ending carries a quiet sadness that never entirely dissipates. In the years after Tombstone, Wyatt and Josephine became life partners in the fullest sense, bound together by decades of shared wandering and shared catastrophe. They traveled the West ceaselessly. San Francisco, where Josephine's family lived, Colorado, where silver and gold were still drawing fortune seekers, New Mexico, Idaho, where Wyatt worked mining claims and ran saloons, and San Diego, where a real estate boom in the late 1880s gave them a brief taste of prosperity before the boom collapsed. Meanwhile, Mattie Blaylock, the woman who had waited for Wyatt to send for her after Tombstone, who had waited for a telegram that never came, while he was already making his new life with Josephine, had been devastated by the abandonment. She had struggled with addiction to laudanum, which she had been taking for chronic headaches, and when Wyatt did not return to her, she drifted back to the only life she knew. She died in Pinal City, Arizona, on July 3, 1888, of an overdose of laudanum. She was in her late 30s. There is no way to make that fact less stark than it is. Behind every frontier legend, there are people who got left behind, who paid real prices for other people's choices. In 1897, hearing news of gold discovered in the Klondike, Wyatt and Josephine boarded a steamship north, part of the last of the great gold rushes. They made it as far as Alaska, though the Yukon River iced over before they could reach the Klondike proper. They spent a winter in the remote town of Rampart, and the following spring made their way to Nome on the Alaskan coast, where another gold rush was just beginning. Wyatt and a partner opened the Dexter Saloon in Nome, by some accounts the first two-story building in the town. At its peak, the operation earned an estimated $80,000. But Josephine had developed a gambling habit, and the money slipped away as quickly as it arrived. Nevada called next. Wyatt tried his hand at the mining boom in Tonopah and Goldfield in the early 1900s, following the scent of new discoveries. He worked his desert mining claims in Vidal, California, a remote spot near the Arizona border where he and Josephine kept a small cottage, and wintered in Los Angeles, where they rented a series of small houses in the West Adams neighborhood. And the world around him was changing so rapidly that it must have sometimes seemed like the life he had lived was not merely the past, but another country entirely. The automobile was transforming the roads. The airplane was transforming the sky. The silent film industry was creating new kinds of celebrity and new kinds of mythology. The frontier that had been Wyatt's entire world, the cattle trails, the boom towns, the open plains where a man could ride for days without seeing another soul, was being paved over, fenced in, settled and domesticated. It was in Los Angeles, in the final decades of his life, that Wyatt Earp found himself embedded in a new and extraordinary world, the world of Hollywood. The silent film industry was booming in the 1910s and early 1920s, and the early Western movies were drawing on the mythology of the frontier that Wyatt had helped create. And he became an informal consultant on Western films, advising young actors and directors about how things had really been, how men had carried their guns, how confrontations had unfolded, what the frontier had actually looked, smelled, and sounded like. William S. Hart, the New York stage actor turned silent film star, became one of Wyatt's closest companions in those years. Tom Mix, the first king of the Cowboys of the silent era, and one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood, became another devoted friend. Hart and Mix were making fortunes playing heroes of a West that Wyatt had actually inhabited, and they treated the old man with a reverence that was entirely genuine. Wyatt spent much of the 1920s deeply frustrated by the versions of his story appearing in newspapers and books. He tried to find someone to tell his story accurately, first working with a mining engineer named John Flood, whose finished manuscript was apparently so bad that no one would publish it. And then, in 1927, a Chicago journalist named Walter Noble Burns published Tombstone, an Iliad of the Southwest, a romanticized account that infuriated Wyatt and sold very well. On Christmas Day 1927, a former press secretary to Theodore Roosevelt named Stuart Lake contacted the aging Lawman about a possible biography. Wyatt agreed to cooperate. He and Lake met a handful of times over the following months, and Lake took notes. The interviews were thin on detail. Wyatt was still reticent, still careful about what he would and would not say, and Lake would later acknowledge that the book he wrote was heavily embellished, that the vivid dialogue he attributed to Wyatt was largely invented. But Wyatt Earp died on January 13, 1929, before the book was finished, and Lake was left to complete it without his subject's input or objection. Wyatt Earp died quietly on a January morning in his small bungalow at 4004 West 17th Street in West Adams, Los Angeles. He was 80 years old. Josephine was with him in his final hours, as he had been ill with chronic cystitis for some time. She later recalled that he regained consciousness briefly, seemed to think something over carefully, said quietly, supposing, and then, after a long pause, oh well. Then he fell asleep for the last time. Those last words are the most human thing Wyatt Earp ever said for the record. Not a summation, not a speech, just a man at the edge of consciousness, working through some final calculation, and then arriving at the frontier man's characteristic acceptance, letting go. The funeral was held at the Pierce Brothers Chapel in Los Angeles. Josephine, overcome with grief, did not attend. But the pallbearers who carried Wyatt Earp to his final rest included Tom Mix and William S. Hart. The Old West and its reflection. John Clum, an old friend from Tombstone days, who had been the editor of the pro-Earp epitaph, was there as well. Wyatt was cremated. 6 months later, Josephine carried his ashes to her family's plot at Hills of Eternity, a Jewish cemetery in Colma, California. That the most famous gunslinger of the American West rests in a Jewish cemetery, having spent the last half of his life with a Jewish woman from Brooklyn, is one of those quietly remarkable facts that history occasionally produces. A reminder that the real stories are always stranger and richer and more human than the legends built around them. Josephine, who outlived Wyatt by 15 years, dying in December 1944, fought fiercely to protect his reputation throughout her widowhood. Objection to biographies she felt were too critical or too revealing, and insisting on the heroic version of the story, even when the evidence was complicated. She died during World War II and was buried beside the man she had loved for nearly half a century, in the Jewish cemetery in Colma. Serious scholars spent the latter half of the 20th century doing the careful, patient work of separating what was real from what was invented, excavating arrest records and newspaper archives and court transcripts and census documents, building a picture of Wyatt Earp that was more complicated, more human, and ultimately more interesting than the legend. He had been a horse thief. He had worked in brothels. He had bent the law in his own favor when it suited him. He had abandoned the woman who loved him when a more glamorous companion appeared. And he had crossed the line between lawman and outlaw more than once, including during the Vendetta Ride, which was morally satisfying and legally dubious in roughly equal measure. But he had also been, by the testimony of the people who worked alongside him in Wichita and Dodge City, an effective and often quietly impressive lawman. He had faced genuine danger with genuine nerve. He had been loyal to his brothers with a ferocity that cost him everything. The question of whether Wyatt Earp was a hero or a villain is the wrong question, and the fact that it has been asked so persistently for so many decades tells us more about what people need to believe than about the man himself. We want the frontier to have been a morality play, populated by heroes in white hats and villains in black ones. And the real story, the complicated one, is better. It is more interesting, more instructive, more genuinely revealing in the ways that matter. Wyatt Earp's story, in its full complexity, is the story of a human being trying to navigate an impossible world, and mostly succeeding, finding love after devastating loss, building a life from disaster, staying loyal when loyalty was expensive, showing up for his brothers in the moments that counted most. He was not perfect. He was sometimes a very flawed man. But he was real, and he was trying to find his place, to honor those he loved, to make something worthy of the years he had been given. And in that trying, in that restless, complicated, human effort, he is not so very different from anyone who has faced hard odds and kept going. History is made by people who keep going, when everything around them is telling them to stop. Wyatt Earp's life was full of moments that would have broken a different man. The loss of Urilla, the years of drift, the violence of Tombstone, the death of Morgan, the legal jeopardy of the Vendetta Ride, the repetitive failures of the mining ventures, the boxing scandal, and the long frustration of watching his own story be told incorrectly by people who had not been there. And he kept going through all of it, not with cheerfulness. The record does not suggest that Wyatt Earp was a cheerful man, but with the determined, adaptive, patient persistence of someone who has decided that giving up is not among the available options. That quality, more than the gunfighting or the badge or the legend, is what makes his story genuinely worth knowing. The gunfight lasted 30 seconds. The life lasted 80 years.